So we've had quite a few messages, some really interesting sources flagged up recently about reforming the UN Security Council. It's this whole ongoing, really complex
It
discussion.
really is a massive topic.
And wading through it, what really jumped out at me was India's position. They seem incredibly firm, especially on rejecting this whole idea of like using religious identity to allocate seats on the council.
That's become a real flashpoint, hasn't it, in an already very tangled debate. I mean, UNSC reform at its heart is asking, how do you make this body, the one meant to keep global peace, actually look like the world now?
Right, not the world of 1945 when it was set up. Right.
Exactly. You've got the 15 members, fine, but the power lies with those 5 permanent members, China, France, Russia, the UK, the US.
Yeah.
And that veto power they hold,
Yeah.
it just shapes everything.
Totally. It creates this massive imbalance today. And that's where India's perspective, which their permanent representative, P. Harish, laid out really clearly. When was it? April 16th, 2025.
Yeah, at one of those intergovernmental negotiations meetings, the IGNs, that's where the member states try to hammer out these reform ideas.
And the topic that day was specifically the size of the future council and regional representation. So perfect storm for this religious representation thing to come up.
Precisely. And that's what we want to dig into today, right? Understand why India is drawing such a hard line against religion as a basis for membership. Why it sticks so firmly to regional representation.
Okay, let's break down India's stance then. Because Harish, he didn't mince words. He basically said bringing religion or faith into it runs completely counter to regional representation, which has been the accepted basis.
Yeah, for representation in the UN, it's a direct shot. She's saying these are fundamentally opposing concepts in the UN context.
It really highlights how they see it. It's not just like impractical, it's a violation of a core principle, almost.
It is. For them, allocating seats based on religion isn't just messy, it undermines the whole structure they believe the UN is operated on, however imperfectly.
It makes me think of, if you were setting up seats at a huge global conference, you've got them arranged by region, and then someone says, hey, let's reseat everyone based on their faith.
Yeah, it would just fracture everything, wouldn't it? Chaos.
Exactly. How would you even get anything done?
And the current system, for all its faults, does have that geographical logic. There are seats earmarked for different regions. Africa and Asia get 5, Latin America and the Caribbean 2, Eastern Europe 1, Western Europe and others get 2. It's an attempt, at least, at global spread.
So throwing religion into that, yeah, it just blows it up.
Completely. And India's reasoning seems to come from a couple of places. First, regional representation isn't new. It's like a long-standing UN norm, even if people argue about the numbers.
There's precedent.
Right. And second, look at India itself. It's incredibly diverse religiously. So the idea of prioritizing one faith over others on a global stage, that must feel incredibly dangerous to them.
Yeah, like importing potential sectarianism right into the heart of the Security Council. A recipe for disaster, maybe?
That seems to be their deep concern. Given their own history and complex society, they're wary of anything that politicizes religious identity at that level. They see the UN's job as uniting nations, and they worry this could do the exact opposite, divide them along faith lines.
Okay, so if India is so strongly against it, who's actually pushing for this religion-based idea? Where is it coming from?
Well, the names that come up most often are Turkey President Erdogan has talked about wanting an Islamic country with veto power, and Pakistan.
Pakistan, right. They've consistently supported more representation for, what was the phrase? The Islamic Ummah.
That's the term, yeah. Their former envoy, Munir Akram, used it.
Yeah.
It refers to the global Muslim community.
But that term itself, Islamic Ummah, it's huge. It's diverse. I mean, who gets to represent that? Which country?
Exactly. That's the immediate practical problem. How do you choose? Is it the biggest population, most influential? And then what about other major global faiths? Hinduism, Catholicism, Buddhism. Where do they fit?
You need seats for everyone. It just sounds impossible to manage fairly.
It becomes a logistical nightmare and incredibly politically charged. Who decides the criteria? How do you possibly balance representation for huge global faiths versus smaller ones, or ones not tied strongly to nation states?
It feels like it would just add layers and layers of complexity onto a reform process that's already, let's be honest, pretty stuck.
Absolutely. So India's rejection seems like an attempt to say, look, let's not make this even harder. We have a framework, geography, let's fix that.
Keep the focus, maybe.
Yeah, prevent the whole thing from collapsing under the weight of trying to represent faiths. Yeah. And this stance aligns pretty closely with their partners in the G4 group.
Ah, yes, the G4. India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. The ones always pushing for a council that reflects the 21st century, not the mid-20th. What's their general take?
They're united on wanting an expanded council, more permanent and non-permanent seats. And crucially, they insist that regional representation has to be the basis for allocating those new seats.
So addressing the fact that whole continents basically are underrepresented now.
Precisely. Africa, Latin America, large parts of Asia. They argue these regions need a much stronger voice.
And the G4 has put actual numbers out there, haven't they? Like expanding to 25 or 26 members total.
Yeah, that's the kind of ballpark. Their proposals usually suggest around 11 permanent members and maybe 14 or 15 non-permanent ones. A significant jump.
The idea being that a bigger council allows for that better regional balance, more legitimacy maybe?
That's the argument. More representative, more legitimate, and hopefully more effective. They see it as essential for tackling today's global issues.
And they've also been really pushing for text-based negotiations. That sounds technical, but I gather it's a big deal in UN circles.
Oh, it's huge strategically. It's basically saying, enough talk, let's start drafting, move beyond these endless cycles of stating positions, and actually work on concrete proposals, language, timelines.
Trying to force some actual progress.
Exactly. Inject momentum. And when they say things like, those resisting real reforms are on the wrong side of history, that's a pretty clear message aimed at those happy with the status quo.
And part of that is pushing back against the idea of only adding non-permanent seats, right? Which is what another group, the Uniting for Consensus group, wants.
Correct. The UFC, that includes countries like Italy, Pakistan, Mexico, they argue for more non-permanent members, but are strongly against creating any new permanent seats.
And India and the G4 see that as insufficient.
Completely. Harish called it out directly, saying it would just entrench the status quo. Their view is, if you don't expand the permanent category to include major players from underrepresented regions, you're not fundamentally changing the power dynamic. It remains an old boys club, essentially.
Whereas the UFC position is sometimes seen as trying to prevent rivals from gaining that permanent status.
That's often the interpretation, yes. Protecting their own regional influence by blocking others from getting a permanent seat at the top table.
Wow. So, okay. G4 wants expansion, both types, regional basis. UFC wants only non-permanent expansion. Then you have these religion-based proposals. It's a crowded field. What about other key players?
Well, you've got the Arab group, logically pushing for proportional Arab representation. France is interesting. They've actually backed the G4's bid for permanent seats, with veto rights, which is significant coming from a P5 member.
That is big. What about Africa?
The African Union has a very clear, long-standing position. They demand at least 2 permanent seats with veto power, plus 5 non-permanent seats, reflecting the continent's size and number of states.
And the existing P5, the ones holding the keys.
It varies. China and Russia are generally seen as the most hesitant, especially about sharing the veto or adding new permanent members who might challenge them. The US, UK, and France have sounded more open to some reform, but always with caveats and protecting their own interests naturally.
It just highlights how incredibly hard this is. You need almost everyone among 193 countries to agree, and you need all 5 permanent members to say yes to changing the rules that give them their power.
It's a massive diplomatic challenge. The ultimate high-stakes negotiation, really.
And going back to the religion idea specifically beyond India's points, what are the wider problems people see with that approach?
Well, first, as we touched on, the sheer impossibility of doing it fairly. How do you classify the world's faiths? Who gets a seat? Who decides? It's just practically unworkable on a global scale.
Right, you get bogged down forever just defining the terms.
Exactly. Second, religion, unfortunately, can be deeply divisive. While it's a force for good for billions, it's also been historically and currently a source of conflict. Do you really want to bake that potential for theological disputes and sectarian tension into the Security Council structure?
It could paralyze it, couldn't it? Trying to get consensus on, say, a ceasefire while arguing about religious doctrine.
Potentially. It risks shifting the focus away from shared security challenges towards religious identity politics. And third, it kind of undermines the whole idea of the UN as a universal body for nations. Because the UN's foundation is based on state sovereignty and, ideally, cooperation between states, regardless of their internal makeup. Regional representation, for all its flaws, tries to group states geographically. Introducing religion creates these cross-national religious blocs, which could alienate states or communities that don't fit neatly, and it moves away from that state-based universal principle.
And it feels like perhaps some of the push for, say, Islamic representation might have geopolitical goals mixed in, not just pure fairness.
It's hard to separate the two entirely. While proponents talk about equity, there's almost certainly an element of seeking greater political influence on the world stage, using religious identity as a lever. It becomes about power projection as much as representation.
So pulling it all together, what's India's big picture vision then? What do they actually want the reformed UNSC to look like?
Their goal, alongside the G4, is pretty clear. A council that's bigger, definitely more inclusive, and just better able to handle 21st century problems. That means a much stronger voice for developing countries, especially from Africa, Asia, Latin America. More transparency, more efficiency too.
And the path there involves those key elements. Expand permanent and non-permanent seats, stick to regional representation, boost developing world voices, and crucially, get those text-based negotiations going.
That's the package. And underlying it all, of course, is India's own long-held ambition for a permanent seat. They make the case based on population, democracy, nuclear status, economic clout.
Arguing they deserve a place at the top table.
Right. And they push back against the idea that adding more permanent members just creates a bigger elite, saying the current P5 is already an outdated elite from 1945.
It still sounds like such an uphill battle, though. Decade this has been talked about.
Oh, it absolutely is. The reform process is notoriously slow, incredibly frustrating for many. The P5 veto hurdle is immense. Regional rivalries complicate things. It's tough.
So the G4 push for actual text negotiations is about trying to break that deadlock.
It's their main lever right now, trying to force the issue. But whether it leads to a breakthrough, well, that remains to be seen. Harish's warning about being on the wrong side of history shows their frustration, but also their determination.
Which brings us back to why should someone listening care about all this? It feels very high level, very diplomatic.
It does, but the UNSC's decisions or lack of decisions genuinely impact things we all see. Wars, sanctions, humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, even coordinating on things like pandemics or climate change to some extent.
So a more representative council might make better decisions, or faster ones.
That's the hope. A council that better reflects the world, particularly the needs of developing nations, might be more effective, more legitimate in its actions. And India's fight against religion-based seats, that's essentially about keeping divisive identity politics out of global security decisions, aiming for fairness based on geography, not faith.
Okay, so the key takeaway really is India is pushing hard for expansion based on regions and pushing back even harder against bringing religion into the mix.
That sums it up perfectly. It's about the principle of regionalism, the practicality of making the council work, and preventing what they see as a dangerous diversion into sectarianism at the highest level.
It really does leave you wondering, though. Given how dug in the P5 are and how many different plans are floating around, what are the actual chances of major reform anytime soon? What could possibly shake things up enough to make it happen?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? It forces you to think about power, about diplomacy, about how international relations actually work or don't work, what kind of crisis or shift would be needed.
It's a reminder of just how complex global governance is and how many different perspectives are involved in trying to build a safer world. Definitely something to keep watching.
Absolutely. This debate isn't going away. Understanding the different positions, like India's strong stance here, is pretty vital for grasping the bigger picture of global politics today. Staying informed is key.